Here's a quick little tip for those of you who are using water-based paint. This is specific to water-based paint. If you're familiar with this channel, you're likely aware that I use Createx water-based paint pretty much exclusively. I use it on all of my custom paint work. One of the downsides to the water-based paint has always been the coverage ability. More so when you're trying to cover multiple different colors. When Createx released the opaque colors, that was a game changer, but they're still not quite on par with a urethane. If you've seen some of my other recent videos painting the skulls, you know that I was using an opaque gray from Createx for the initial stages. And once you've reduced your opaque paint down to about a 1-to-1 mix ratio, which is what I normally prefer, you're cutting the ability for that paint to really cover dark colors or multiple colors well. That's the downside. So in this case, I'm working on the fuel tank, the other side of this fuel tank, and I want to paint another skull very similar to what I did on the other side, right in this area where that cutout paper stencil was. The downside is I've already got some other artwork here that's going to be overlapped by this new skull. I could come in with the illustration opaque neutral gray number 7 and paint this skull the same way that I showed you in the previous videos. However, the covering ability of that paint is going to be very difficult because we have reds, oranges, and blacks all in this area. I can demonstrate what I'm talking about on the backboard of my easel relatively quickly. I've got some red paint on the backboard of the easel along with some darker colors underneath and darker up above. When I'm painting a skull and underpainting texture like I've demonstrated in a few of my recent videos, I'm using this technique where I allow the paint to flow and then I start randomly moving the airbrush around in order to build that initial base layer of texture. Hopefully what you can see is happening here, because I'm working over two different values of color, the texture over the red still has a lot of red behind it. The texture over the darker background has that darker background. I would prefer that to be uniform. So in order to get it uniform, I could paint over the red several times, which I'm generally layering several layers of this texture anyway when I'm doing this on an actual project. But I'm still seeing a difference in shade and tone behind the texture. You can still see red behind the lower portion of this that I just painted. This opaque color will absolutely cover the red if we were painting just a uniform coat versus the texture. So there's a little bit better view of what I just did, and hopefully you can still see the red peeking through the texture side on the backboard of my easel. So the trick becomes, how do we mask off a specific area that's surrounded by other artwork? And I do that with a loose paper stencil. I'll come in and cut a paper mask to the size of the skull that I want using just a photocopy of my sketch of the design before I actually paint it. And then I can come in with just the black base coat that I used for this motorcycle, and I'll paint this black. Again, I really prefer using a loose paper cut mask to do this because I won't have to deal with paint edges. I might get a little bit of overspray flowing underneath the mask when I fill all of this in with black, but it's not that big a deal. The other problem I have is I'm working on a curved surface, and this is a flat piece of paper, so it's not going to lay perfectly flat on this surface. I can use the cutout portion of the stencil to make sure that it's not crazy out of whack. If it's slightly larger in one little area, that's fine. I can work with that later while I'm actually painting the skull. That looks pretty good. I'm going to put another piece of tape down right here. And then the trick is just to kind of hold the edges of the paper down around the area that you're spraying. So I have some Wicked Black in my airbrush. I'm going to start blocking all of this out in this black. The black will cover all of these other colors pretty quickly and pretty easily. Making sure to dry the paint in between layers. See the way I'm working around this mask, going in one little section at a time, helps me to keep the mask flat on the surface of the tank in the area that I'm actually painting, whereas in the areas around it, it's lifting up. That'll allow me to keep a nice sharp edge around the perimeter, which is ultimately what I want. So I gave that a few minutes to dry while I cleaned the airbrush. And now I can remove my loose paper mask, set it aside, and I'll run a tack rag over this quickly just to remove any very light loose overspray. And now I'm ready to paint the skull in the same fashion that I've painted the last couple of skulls in videos on the channel. The nice thing about this is now I have a solid black base coat to work from. It didn't require a lot of paint to cover what was already on here. You can't feel the paint line anywhere around that. So it just makes it a lot easier for coverage to make sure all of your tones and values match when you start putting lighter colors over the black. Had I gone over the reds and the oranges that were below this originally with just the neutral gray number 7, it would have taken a while to really get rid of the reds and the oranges behind that opaque color. So I hope that helps some of you out. Hope you got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I will see you all next time.